Welcome back. We just finished laying out the basics for understanding the climate change issue.
Yes.
Now we're ready to dive into some of the data.
All right.
This is my favorite part here.
Okay.
Okay, since much of the debate revolves around CO2 emissions, let's start there. In 1860, the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere was approximately 285 parts per million,
Okay.
or 0.029%. Now, as of 2020, it was 410 parts per million, or 0.41%. So that's just under 50% increase over 160 years. And the current rate of increase is about 2 parts per million per year.
Okay. Meanwhile, the planet has warmed by about 0.8 degrees Celsius since 1880. But half of this occurred before any significant change to the CO2. This graph shows both the man-made CO2 emissions and global temperature changes from 1850 to 2010. The green line shows an increase in man-made CO2, most of it since 1940, you can see. The black line shows fluctuations in overall temperature. Now notice that the rate of temperature increase from 1860 to 1880, when there was relatively little man-made CO2, is about the same as for the most recent period when emissions were about 60 times higher.
Interesting.
Now also note that there were dips in temperature at times when CO2 emissions were still going up.
So the increase in temperature cannot be entirely due to man-made CO2.
No.
Now, that's not to say, it isn't a factor, but it's just maybe not the most significant one.
Right.
Human contribution to CO2 emissions by burning fossil fuels accounts for less than 5% of the total global carbon budget. I mean, other factors include things like changes in land use, deforestation, volcanoes, CO2 release from the oceans as they warm, the breakdown of organic remains such as dead wood and forests, and other factors like that.
Yeah, and CO2 is just one of many greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. These gases are important for life on Earth because without them, the average temperature would be about 33 degrees Celsius lower than it is now.
Oh.
So,
Woo, that'd be cold.
a little chilly, yeah.
Now, nearly all of the warming effect is actually due to a powerful greenhouse gas called, are you ready for this? Water vapor.
Water vapor, yeah.
There's only about 3.3 degrees of it is from CO2, man-made or otherwise. Yet it's CO2 that we hear about most often.
Yeah, and that's astounding, isn't it? That water vapor is a far more significant greenhouse gas.
Right. And other greenhouse gases include, methane, nitrous oxide, chlorofluorocarbons. It seems strange that water is often left out of the climate change debate, but it has a much greater effect on temperature than greenhouse gases. Maybe we should focus on, reducing our water vapor emissions.
Not sure that'll work, but even assuming if all of the 2 parts per million increase in CO2 is man-made, it would take nearly 200 years to double the level to 800. So why panic?
Right.
Why panic?
That's actually a good question. Is it really about following the science?
Well,
The climate change debate is dominated by not just naturalism, but also humanism and neo-Marxism.
yes.
Some of the rhetoric is more about politics and philosophy than saving the planet. Consider this statement from economist Ottmar Edenhofer, an official with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And he says, but one must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. Obviously, the owners of coal and oil will not be enthusiastic about this. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore.
Yeah, and that's a mainstream, and it's becoming more of a mainstream viewpoint. A more radical activist, Stuart Baston, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, he wrote this, "And I'm here to say that XR, Extinction Rebellion, isn't about the climate. You see, the climate's breakdown is a symptom of a toxic system that has infected the ways we relate to each other as humans and to all life." So, and he goes on to say pretty much that he's given up on fixing the climate. But the real problems include things like white supremacy and class hierarchy. He says that Extinction Rebellion is about fixing the system, which essentially means destroying Western society.
Wow.
That's where they're going with this.
And some radical political parties have used environmentalism to promote sweeping change, such as reduction of world population and destruction of free markets. Now, this would lead to widespread poverty, and they hope would make folks more likely to vote for neo-Marxist policies. Ironically, the environment has suffered in all Marxist countries to date.
Yeah. So one question for activists is, why not focus on the biggest CO2 contributors like China and India? In 2018, for example, China generated almost 1,000 gigawatts of electricity from coal. The United States was only 261, and Australia, for example, had 36. China and India are planning hundreds more coal-fired power stations. Australia, for example, accounts for only 1.2% of the world's emissions, but like other Western nations, they're targeted by activists far more than China. I mean, it's not that Western nations shouldn't reduce emissions,
Right.
but shouldn't the protests be focused on the biggest offenders? You would
right.
think?
You'd think so. Now, the U.S. Has recently reduced emissions by focusing more on natural gas, which
Right.
emits far less CO2 than coal. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, identified nuclear power as an important alternative.
Yes.
But it currently generates only about 10% of the world's electricity from just 440 reactors. Now, it's both green and relatively cheap over the long term, but most activists, they don't seem very interested in it.
Yeah.
So it's not just about following the science, and after the break, we'll focus on some other strange facts about climate change.
Have the fish in New York's Hudson River evolved into super mutants? A large proportion of the river's Atlantic tomcod fish have developed resistance to certain poisons, and the mass media has heralded this as a dramatic example of evolution in action. However, far from supporting microbes to man evolution, these mutant fish have actually devolved, not evolved. That's because the fish have become resistant through a loss of genetic information. Non-resistant fish have special proteins in their cells that allow the poisons to bind. However, due to a genetic mutation, the proteins of resistant fish cannot bind the poisons as readily, so corrupted proteins have made the fish resistant. And in the poison-rich environment of the Hudson River, it's no wonder that the mutated gene facilitating resistance has quickly spread throughout the tomcod population. It is misleading to call these changes evolution, because evolution requires the addition of new genetic information, but these resistant fish have only demonstrated information loss.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Help more people see this video. Give the video a like, subscribe, and share the video on Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah, this shows the algorithm that you appreciate the content.
That's right, yeah. Climate change is a huge issue,
Right.
and it's a big part of many people's worldview.
Thinking properly about our relationship with the environment is important.
That's right. That's why sharing this video is important. Get it out there.
Get it out there. Let's get back to the show.
There seems to be some shady things going on, especially when there's money to be made. Now, for example, former U.S. Vice President Al Gore is well known for promoting the need to reduce our so-called carbon footprint, yet his mansion uses about 21 times as much energy as the average U.S. home. Now, to offset this, he buys carbon credits, but he buys them from companies that he founded to trade carbon credits, companies now worth millions.
There's also something fishy about the infamous hockey stick graph.
Yes, there is.
The graph shows that after a 1,000-year period of relatively stable temperatures, there was a dramatic spike within the last century, particularly in the last few decades. This is usually attributed to the use of fossil fuels. However, this graph has been shown to be fraudulent.
Yes, yeah, it doesn't record either the medieval warming period or the Little Ice Age from the mid-1300s to about 1885. When we add those back, the graph should look more like this, showing fluctuations in global temperatures before any increase in man-made CO2 emissions.
Well, it's said that a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yes.
Well, the image of that fraudulent graph was a fear-mongering tactic that influenced millions of people.
Yeah, that's right. And the fear it produced motivated people to vote in climate activists.
There's also a lesson from history here, and that's that the world was better off when global temperatures were warmer.
Yes.
In commenting on a TV documentary about global warming, anti-creationist Ian Plimmer said, "Groups like BAMUS and the IPCC deny, minimize, or ignore significant recent climate changes that gave us the Roman warming, the Dark Ages, the medieval warming, and the Little Ice Age. Both history and archaeology show that in previous warmings, temperatures were far higher than at present. Populations and economy thrived.
Nice.
Previous coolings led to famine, depopulation, and social disruption. History shows that it is dangerous to ignore history."
Yes, yeah. So a little warmer is actually a little better.
Better, yeah.
Okay, so it's clear that there are other goals mixed in with the climate change debate, right? And it's not just about saving the planet and following the science, there's outright fraud. Now, let's talk about the predictions made by activists, including the IPCC, and compare them with the actual data. In the 1970s, we were told, and many of you will remember this, that we're heading for another ice age, right?
What scientists are telling us now is that the threat of an ice age is not as remote as they once thought.
At weather stations in the far north, temperatures have been dropping for 30 years. Seacoasts, long free of summer ice, are now blocked year-round. According to some climatologists, within a lifetime, we might be living in the next ice age.
Now, that didn't happen.
No.
Oops. But some of the same experts who predicted global cooling started talking about global warming. But then again, those predictions didn't materialize. So today it's just called climate change. Right? It's just climate change.
Yeah. For example, in 2008, Dr. Tim Flannery from the Australian government's Climate Change Unit said, just imagine yourself in a world 5 years from now, so that would be 2013.
2013.
Yeah, when there's no more ice over the Arctic.
Oh.
In that same year, Al Gore made a similar prediction. That was the common view of the mainstream climate scientists at the time. Now, the minimum annual coverage of Arctic sea ice has declined from a high of about 7.5 million square kilometers in 1990. But it was actually higher in 2020 than it was in 2012, at nearly 4 million square kilometers.
And that's a lot of ice.
That's still a lot of ice.
So the predictions were way off.
Yeah.
And by the way, the fluctuations in the amount of Arctic ice over time are expected. That this was especially true after the post-flood ice age a few thousand years ago.
Right.
Now, we said before that it's generally agreed that the greenhouse effect of a doubling of atmospheric CO2 means the temperature rises about 1.1 degrees Celsius. So at the current rates, it'll take about 200 years to double the CO2 concentration, resulting in another 1.1 degrees. So what's the big deal? What's the big deal?
The big deal is because climate models include positive feedback or amplification, mostly from increased water vapor as a result of warming oceans. The idea is that for the 1.1 degree of warming caused by a CO2 increase alone, the ECS, or equilibrium climate sensitivity, would result in a total increase of between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees.
Okay.
Okay, so how do the climate models compare with the observations?
Yeah. Well, predicting future temperature is difficult.
Yeah.
Even the IPCC noted in 2001, the climate system is a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system, and therefore the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible.
Oh, yeah, but they went ahead anyway.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Using over 100 different models.
Yeah, okay. So if the science is settled, as we often hear, all you need is one.
Yeah, that should do it.
The one based on science.
Well, this graph shows the many predictions from 102 models. The black line represents the average. Notice all of the actual readings from 3 different satellites, the green, red, and blue lines. The actual data is much lower than any of the 102 models predicted, even though CO2 levels went up. There's a fail.
No kidding. The models are simply wrong. But wait, there's more prediction failures. Model predictions for ocean temperatures were also wrong. This graph shows the models in red compared to the actual data from over 3,000 robotic instruments floating all over the oceans from 2004 to 2012. Another fail.
If positive feedback occurs from increased water vapor, there should be an atmospheric hotspot in the middle latitudes at the tropics.
Okay.
Again, note the models in red versus actual data from satellites and weather balloons. None of the data showed any hotspots. Fail again.
Seeing a pattern here, right? Let's keep going. Increased water vapor is supposed to trap more of the incoming solar radiation, so more warming. As sea surface temperature rises, there should be less outgoing radiation from the Earth, but satellite measurements show outgoing radiation is increasing, the opposite of IPCC predictions. Yet another fail.
The data shows positive feedback isn't operating.
No.
In fact, there's strong evidence for negative feedback,
Yeah.
probably resulting from enhanced cloud cover reflecting the sun's radiation back into space. When negative feedback is taken into consideration, the warming effect of doubling atmospheric CO2 is only about 0.5 degrees Celsius, nowhere near the 4.5 degrees that some have predicted.
No.
Similarly, a comprehensive study from a German company arrived at an ECS of 0.7 degrees, and they also concluded that negative feedbacks more than offset positive feedback. So, the bottom line here is we don't need drastic action to stay within the 1.5 degree target.
No. And look, we're just getting started. Time's winding down here, but we'll continue next week. There are some very interesting things we'll talk about then. But even now, aren't you shocked by some of the data that we've presented here?
We used to hear about how, the science is settled, but,
Yes.
we don't even hear that anymore. The idea that increased CO2 is going to roast the planet, that's just assumed to be a fact now.
Right, yeah. And if you don't believe it, well, you're just uneducated, or you're a denier, right? On the same level as somebody who believes that God created the earth about 6,000 years ago, right? You just don't understand science.
Yeah.
Is the notion.
Yeah, and there's the notion that 97% of scientists agree that man-made CO2 will cause catastrophic global warming. Actually, let's start with that claim next week.
Yeah, sounds good. Thomas and Alexander will be hosting next week's show, and they can start with that. Now remember, Christianity is an evidence-based faith.
And science supports Scripture.
See you next week. Thanks so much for watching. Now, once episode 2 is up, we'll put a link in the description below.
And that will provide another half hour of content from Dr. Don Batten's massive article.
Yes, yeah, this is a huge issue. And there was so much content in that article that we dedicated 2 episodes to it.
Yeah, that's still not enough.
That's still not enough. Now, you'll need to look up the article at creation.com/climate change to get all the details.
Hey, enjoy your reading, and we'll see you next week.